They're trying to outsmart the Russians and use more motivated troops to kind of push them back in the Kharkiv region. And they will keep doing it. There are a lot of motivated Ukrainian troops who perhaps have been even more galvanized into taking action than they were before because of this new offensive. It's not the Donbass that's dragging on, it's a new assault on Kharkiv, an area that they'd previously won in.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot, and we are joined this time from Ukraine by Maxim Tucker, an editor on the Times' foreign desk who was in Kyiv and Kyiv correspondent between 2014 and 2016. Maxim has returned to report from the front line since 2022 and he's speaking to us now from Kharkiv. Maxim, thank you very much for your time. We are talking days into a Russian probing incursion into the Kharkiv Oblast from Russia. How are things where you are in Kharkiv city?
So Kharkiv city is under very heavy bombardment. It's been intensified since the offensive started on Friday. There are glide bombs coming in from Russian jets, and there are cruise missiles hitting the city every single night, even into the afternoon sometimes. So there's a very heavy bombardment of Kharkiv city itself. But the Russians are still not within artillery range, and that's one of the concerns that is here in Kharkiv city, is that if the Russians can win the battle for Lyptsi, which is a very ferocious battle being fought in a village outside Kharkiv now, they will be able to bring their barrel artillery into range of the city centre.
I'm just wondering, having been there and also in the foxhole, what is the actual morale like of the soldiers that you've encountered?
So it's always a difficult one because the special forces units tend to have a much higher morale. They're very motivated. They understand why they're fighting. They take generally fewer casualties because they're tasked with special operations, and they're not just holding the line, sitting in a trench all the time. And infantry, generally when we've spoken to infantry, they're more tired, they're more exhausted, they're shell shocked, and they find it difficult because they need people to hold the line and they don't have enough people. So there's always a different motivating factor. Now what's happened in Kharkiv is that the initial territorial defence and some of the infantry brigades who were tasked with holding this line and creating fortifications didn't do that particularly well, and Ukrainians had to rush in lots of different special forces units in order to bolster the line, and different assault brigades who are volunteers and very highly motivated. So when you go and speak to those people, they are very motivated, and the morale is good, and they're determined to push the Russians back, and they're happy actually that there are lots of special forces operators in the area because that makes it feel like an important thing for them. But clearly the fighting is difficult and they are losing their comrades, so that will take a toll.
Because one of the theories is that this probing action was to divert and have Ukrainian forces redeployed to this area. Do you get a sense of which forces have been deployed and how many?
Well, I think that's not something they'd be willing to talk about because obviously they want to keep it very secret. But there is definitely a sense that special forces operators who might normally be tasked with support operations in places like Chasiv Yar or in Donbass or in the south are now being rushed into Kharkiv and not available for missions in other areas. I think most of the infantry brigades, the mechanized brigades, are not being suddenly withdrawn, but assault brigades who would be tasked with counteroffensive operations and special forces are moving to Kharkiv, that's for sure.
Do you get a sense now, because it was a question that you were asking earlier on in your reporting, as to what the actual objective is? Is it to take Kharkiv city or to get within range and destroy it?
So I think the Russians would definitely like to take Kharkiv, but they've only got what is believed to be around 50,000 men on the other side of the border, which is clearly not enough men to take a city the size of Kharkiv. What they're probably intending to do is to push as far as possible as they can into Kharkiv region behind Ukrainian lines, cause as much disruption, cause as many casualties as possible, and get within firing range of Kharkiv in order to start making life there untenable. And that seems to be kind of Putin's plan in a way, that if he can't capture Ukraine, he will just destroy it and make it a kind of not a viable nation. And as the second city in Ukraine with a population of pre-war population of 1.5 million people, it's a really important economic and cultural hub for the country. So, it may well be that they're trying to drive through to Lyptsi just to get within artillery range and make it very difficult for the Ukrainians. And the other effort that is in the Vovchansk direction seems to be more about complicating logistics for the Ukrainian forces which are defending Kupiansk and preventing the Russians from capturing more of the Donbass area.
So how does this fit into other parts of the front line and the options that the Russian forces have?
Well, I think it's trying to make use of Russia's superiority in manpower now that they have the initiative, and trying to make use of the delay in the arrival of Western weaponry. I think some of artillery ammunition has clearly arrived, and there is a lot of outgoing artillery from the Ukrainians, but much more of the complicated weaponry, the sophisticated weaponry, the missiles, they still don't have very many ATACMS. They still don't have very many Patriots and Patriot missile batteries, which are vital now that the Russians have introduced this long-range glide bomb, which they keep improving and making the range of it longer and longer. And that is making life in cities like Kharkiv already very difficult, because there's simply no way to stop those bombs unless you can shoot down the aircraft that's dropping them. And as they're dropping them at a very long range, at very high altitude, they really need something as sophisticated as a Patriot or an air force full of F-16s in order to be able to defeat them.
And is there anything that Ukrainians can do to defend themselves when they're waiting so desperately for those air defence and those surface-to-air missiles? Well,
that's been one of the complaints from the Ukrainians, that these what they call cabs, the glide bombs. There really is nothing they can do. There's no way that the ground forces can shoot down these jets, and once the bombs are in the air, you can't stop them. So that's been a really serious complaint from all the Ukrainian forces. That's the thing they desperately need, is the ability to shoot down Russian jets. I mean, in the meantime, they're trying to be innovative. They're trying to create, havoc inside Russia with their own homemade drones. They're trying to outsmart the Russians and use more motivated troops to kind of push them back in the Kharkiv region. And they will keep doing it. There are a lot of motivated Ukrainian troops who perhaps have been even more galvanized into taking action than they were before because of this new offensive. It's not the Donbass that's dragging on, it's a new assault on Kharkiv, an area that they'd previously won in. So that has kind of galvanized a lot of people, I think, into realizing that the war is still going to affect the entire country and not just people that are living in the Donbass and the south.
Is it possible to be able to say yet what the tempo of this offensive is going to be in Kharkiv Oblast?
Well, there was an initial rapid advance, I think, within 5 kilometers within the first weekend. And they did that by encircling and infiltrating a lot of the Ukrainian positions. But I think the Ukrainians have now realized what the small group tactic is, and they're adjusting their way of fighting to stop it. And they've brought in more special forces to counter these infantry on infantry battles. So I think the Ukrainians are in the process of stabilizing the front line. They're definitely under a lot of pressure because they are facing this intense artillery barrage and heavy bombing. But they're in the process of stabilizing it. The Russians haven't moved that quickly since the initial weekend. I mean, it's incremental advances, but they are still in a position where they have a superiority in artillery and a superiority in air power, which they can use to attrite the Ukrainian forces and perhaps grind them forward in the way that they have done in other cities.
And can you just explain to me a little bit more about how this new Russian small group tactic is actually being used?
Yeah, so it's, groups of up to 20 soldiers who will try and use the available cover as much as possible, tree lines, river valleys, avoid open fields, maybe attack at night. And these are, from what special forces were telling me today, is that they have been very professional Russian soldiers. So they think that these are Russian military intelligence or Russian specialized FSB groups who are well trained and moving professionally and not afraid and not panicking when they come into contact with the enemy. So that seems to be the tactic now. Don't rely on the vehicles so much. Try and infiltrate and encircle Ukrainian positions, and then fight on the Russian terms. And that is different from kind of bringing in huge columns like we saw in the initial attack on Kiev, where you had long columns of tanks, which are just vulnerable now to FPV drones and artillery fire and other kinds of drones.
And how are the Ukrainian forces responding to it? You said they've adapted to this new tactic. How are they dealing with it?
So they've brought in infantry that are prepared to kind of fight other infantry at a pace of 20 meters in very small, in very close contact fighting, and that it takes a special kind of soldier. It's a very difficult thing to do, to keep your nerve in those situations. So they've brought in their assault brigades and their special forces units in order to bolster the infantry in those areas, and then they're trying to use drone warfare as effectively as possible to find the Russians as soon as they advance and drop bombs on them. And I think it was interesting to me to see yesterday that the Russians are still trying to advance in broad daylight in the middle of the day. And in one instance, when we watched about 13 Russian soldiers get killed by this drone unit who were dropping grenades on them and flying FPV drones into advancing Russian troops, at the end of the day, there were still another 20 Russian soldiers who were advancing in exactly the same line, exactly the same direction. So although the tactics of the opening weekend might have been very different, it looks like Russia is kind of resorting to just carrying on sending men over the top to try and find a way through.
So do you get the impression that although at the beginning they were perhaps more experienced and professional soldiers, they're now sending the less professional ones in almost a sort of this meat grinder sort of waves of tactics?
Well, it looked like this. They were all pretty well equipped. The weapons that they had were good, and they had good uniforms. So it's not the kind of Stormzy penal colony soldiers here, but it does seem different from the initial attacks happened between 3 and 6 o'clock in the morning on Friday, and there were special forces who clearly had night vision equipment, were used to fighting at night and not panicking, and maybe during the day they're using a different group of soldiers just to try and make some kind of advances.